The leak didn't arrive as a dramatic reveal or a single piece of undeniable evidence. It surfaced quietly, through fragments that began aligning in ways they never had before. Small details, once dismissed as coincidence, suddenly pointed in the same direction. When that happens, secrecy doesn't collapse, it erodes. What made this moment different was the timing. For years, the narrative surrounding Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson had hovered in ambiguity, fueled by chemistry and restrained by silence. That silence had worked, until it didn't. The pressure didn't come from one source, but from many voices beginning to echo the same questions. Leaks like this rarely have a single origin. They form when multiple boundaries weaken at once, schedules overlap unexpectedly, reactions diverge, and communication patterns shift. Each change on its own means little, but together they create momentum. Momentum is what turns private understanding into public suspicion. Insiders described a growing sense that control was slipping, not because of recklessness, but exhaustion. Maintaining distance, managing tone, and correcting interpretation requires constant effort. Over time, that effort becomes unsustainable. When vigilance drops even slightly, details escape. The first signs were behavioral rather than factual. Responses that once came quickly were delayed, and denials that once felt automatic no longer arrived. Silence, previously strategic, began to feel reactive. In Hollywood, that distinction matters. Observers also noted how past moments were suddenly recontextualized. Interviews that once seemed routine were revisited, pauses re-examined, and choices reinterpreted. The leak wasn't new information, but a new framework. Once that framework exists, everything fits inside it. What gave the story traction was how consistent the patterns appeared across time. This wasn't about a single incident or recent event. It was about a thread that seemed to run uninterrupted, occasionally hidden but never fully severed. Consistency across years is difficult to fabricate. Another factor was how evenly the narrative spread. There was no dramatic counterstatement to shut it down. Instead, there was careful neutrality, as if acknowledging the conversation without engaging it. That approach can contain damage, but it can also confirm that something delicate is being protected. The idea of a secret affair didn't gain traction because of sensational claims. It gained traction because of alignment. Multiple observers reached similar conclusions independently, based on behavior rather than testimony. When interpretation converges without coordination, it feels organic. This convergence made the leak feel inevitable rather than scandalous. It suggested that the secret, if one existed, wasn't exposed by betrayal, but by gravity. Too much attention, too much history, and too much restraint eventually pull things into view. Secrets don't always end, sometimes they simply become visible. What intensified speculation was how both parties appeared to respond differently. Not through statements, but through posture, availability, and rhythm. Asymmetry in response often signals internal negotiation. When people process the same situation differently, observers assume there is more beneath the surface. Importantly, the leak did not offer clarity, only direction. It pointed towards something unresolved rather than something proven. That ambiguity made it harder to dismiss. Clear lies can be corrected, but unclear truths linger. Industry analysts often say that the most believable stories are the ones that don't try to convince. This leak didn't persuade, it accumulated. It allowed audiences to arrive at conclusions gradually, feeling as though they discovered the truth themselves. That sense of discovery is powerful. By the end of this first phase, the conversation had shifted permanently. It was no longer about whether something existed, but about how long it had existed unnoticed. That shift reframed everything that came before it. Silence, once protective, became suspect. What lingered was not outrage, but recognition. Recognition that some connections resist closure, and some boundaries are maintained only as long as energy allows. When that energy fades, even the best-kept secrets begin to speak. This stage of the story didn't confirm a relationship, but it dismantled denial. It showed how secrecy can survive scrutiny, until scrutiny becomes constant. And once that threshold is crossed, leaks don't need proof. They only need time. Once the leak settled into public awareness, the story entered a far more dangerous phase. This was no longer about guessing whether something existed, but about watching how everyone reacted now that the silence had fractured. In Hollywood, reaction often reveals more than evidence ever could. And in this case, the reactions did not align neatly. For Jamie Dornan, the aftermath appeared heavier than expected. He didn't rush to shut the narrative down, nor did he attempt to redirect it with humor or dismissal. Instead, his public presence became noticeably more controlled, as if every appearance required recalibration. That level of caution suggested damage control, not confusion. Observers pointed out that when false stories gain traction, they are usually denied quickly and decisively. What unfolded here was different. The lack of a firm denial allowed the idea of a hidden affair to breathe. Silence stopped functioning as protection and began to look like containment. At the same time, Dakota Johnson seemed to process the situation differently. She did not adjust her public demeanor in any dramatic way, nor did she appear defensive. That steadiness stood in contrast to the tightening atmosphere around Jamie. When two people respond unevenly to the same pressure, it invites interpretation. The public quickly seized on this imbalance. Some read it as confidence, others as detachment, but few saw it as coincidence. In narrative terms, asymmetry is compelling because it implies different stakes. If nothing existed, many wondered, why would the burden appear uneven? Behind the scenes, insiders described a shift from ambiguity to caution. Conversations were filtered, exposure was minimized, and unnecessary proximity was avoided. These are not the behaviors of people ignoring a rumor. They are the behaviors of people managing consequences. What made the leak especially volatile was its impact on existing relationships. Secrets, when sustained over long periods, don't explode immediately when exposed. They corrode. Trust is weakened not by confirmation, but by realization that something endured unspoken. That realization carries its own emotional toll. Industry professionals often note that once a secret relationship narrative escapes into the open, denial becomes risky. A denial invites scrutiny, timelines, and contradiction. Silence, though imperfect, limits escalation. But it also concedes control of interpretation to the public. As days passed, the story evolved from leak to assumption in certain spaces. Not universally, but enough to change the tone of discussion. The question was no longer, did it happen? But, how did it stay hidden for so long? That reframing marked a point of no return. Fans began revisiting earlier moments with renewed intensity. Old interviews were replayed, shared looks reanalyzed, and restrained answers reconsidered. Memory became evidence, not because it proved anything, but because it fit the newly accepted framework. Once a narrative crystallizes, it pulls the past into alignment. What complicated matters further was the absence of closure. There was no statement to confirm, deny, or contextualize the leak. That vacuum allowed the story to persist without resolution. Stories without endings tend to last longer than those with clear conclusions. For Jamie, the cost appeared to be internal as much as external. Managing public interpretation while protecting private reality is exhausting. Every move becomes strategic, every silence intentional. Living inside that tension reshapes behavior over time. For Dakota, the scrutiny highlighted how little control one can have over narratives built around restraint. Saying nothing does not guarantee privacy. Sometimes, it intensifies curiosity. The quieter the response, the louder the speculation becomes. Ultimately, the leak did not function as a reveal in the traditional sense. It didn't deliver proof or confession. It delivered inevitability. It made people feel that something long contained had finally become visible, whether fully understood or not. What remains unresolved is not the existence of an affair, but the endurance of the connection implied by it. The leak suggested continuity rather than event, something sustained rather than sparked. That implication is harder to dismiss than any single claim. In the end, the most damaging aspect of the leak wasn't exposure, but permanence. Once the idea entered public consciousness, it could not be fully erased. Even if nothing more ever surfaced, the narrative had found a foothold. And in Hollywood, that is often how secrets truly end. Not with proof, not with confession, but with the quiet realization that silence can no longer hold what it once did.